And now the next person is the wonderful and fabulous Allie King, the VP of Government Affairs at Forescout Tech, Inc., and she's going to be announcing the next session.
Okay, can you hear me? All right, perfect. Well, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. So when the United Women in Cyber Planning Committee were getting together earlier this summer, we were given the task of make it not just better, but also to ensure that the folks that we did bring on board, that they were leading experts. And I have to say, I'm a little starstruck by the next panel that we have coming up here on modern day cyber warfare. And so they're gonna do a wonderful job of kind of diving into the details on why cyber attacks aren't just a military problem. They're no longer a law enforcement problem, but it's an everybody problem because everybody's on the battlefield. If you're online, you are on the battlefield, whether you like it or not. So it's something that we all need to be cognizant of. And to fully explore this topic, we've got Colonel Natalie Vanatta, who has a PhD and is the Joint NSA U.S. Cyber Command China Outcomes Group lead from West Point. So we welcome her. We have my good friend, Stacy O'Mara, who's head of government strategy, policy, and partnerships at Mandiant, which is now a Google company. And we have my former boss, Admiral Mark Montgomery, who's the executive director for the cybersolarium.org and a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And another great friend of mine, we've got Cynthia Kaiser, who's the Deputy Assistant Director at FBI for the Cybersecurity Division. And our wonderful moderator is McLaughlin, who is a cybersecurity attorney, policy advisor, and author of Battlefield Cyber, How China and Russia Are Undermining Our Democracy and National Security. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Allie. First, can everyone hear us? We want to make sure that excellent. It is truly an honor to be sitting on stage with this really incredible group of people in cybersecurity, but in cyber warfare at all levels of government as well as in the private sector. As Allie mentioned, when we look at cybersecurity, we need to look at it in a different way, and we need to continuously be growing the way we're looking at it in our understanding. It's no longer an IT problem. It's no longer something that's relegated to just our IT or our cybersecurity personnel. It's an everyone problem. It's a C-suite problem. It's a child's problem because everyone's on social media, everyone's connecting to the internet. Our adversaries know this, and whether we like it or not, they view this full spectrum as a battlefield, and so we need to as well. So the panel we've assembled before you has touch points in all aspects of cybersecurity and all aspects of cyber warfare, from law enforcement to the private sector to legislative affairs to the military. And what we're going to talk about today is the intersection of cybersecurity and cyber warfare and the way in which we think everyone needs to be looking at this problem from a more holistic perspective. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend Cynthia, and we're going to start off with the first question. And Cynthia, something we talked about in prior panels, but also something that we've heard a lot today in general. There's an overlap between cyber criminals and nation states that is growing, and it's something that we are contending with every day, and certainly something that both the FBI and the military and the intelligence community as well are all contending with. As you're seeing more and more overlap between cyber criminals and nation states, what are the implications for the US as from a government perspective, the FBI from a law enforcement perspective, and writ large how we contend with this issue?
So I think it's better to really think about even just cyber criminals and nation-state actors not as a big divide between them or even as overlap, but this big continuum where you have nation-state actors who might be doing criminal activity as a side job to make money. You have cyber criminal actors who are just acting with impunity in their country. And then you also have cyber criminal actors or just even contractors doing criminal activities on behalf of a nation-state. So I think it's messy. And because it's messy, the attribution becomes messy as well. And the way we really think about like how we want to impose risks and consequences on our cyber adversaries so that they're deterred from conducting activities in the future is complicated. But I think when you kind of ask, like, what does it mean just for government? What does it mean for law enforcement? I think what it means is for law enforcement, we're able to work alongside our federal our law enforcement partners internationally to be able to have criminal consequences against cyber actors, and we do that for a variety of reasons. It doesn't mean that we are always going to arrest the people we can get, but it means that we're doing it so that we take away their private sector opportunities, their travel opportunities, or we just send a message to others saying you can't do this anymore. But looking at the past year and a half with the Ukraine conflict, I think it's brought up a lot of questions that we're going to need to grapple with more as a government, and that's like, at what point do proxies become tools of our nation state actors? At what point are we doing country-based attribution instead of this exact organization or this exact government? And I say that because we think about like the different cyber groups that came out and said we're pro-Russia, or they were doing DDoS activities on behalf of Russia or against targets, really to influence or incite mayhem. And you have to kind of take that step back and say, when a cyber criminal group is being protected by a state, is doing the aims of a state, like, we at some point need to grapple with what is our definition for whether that's a nation state activity or not. I don't think we're there, but to me, those are the really important questions that especially the last year and a half have brought up.
Hey, can I pick up
Please.
on something on attribution? I agree with everything Cynthia said. Attribution is really challenging for us. If recently, in the last few years, Iran launched a series of cruise missile and drone strikes at Saudi Aramco. You know, we saw it within a minute or two, the launches inside, Central Command and other places. Within 3 or 4 minutes, there's an authorized disclosure or background leak to the press saying, hey, this was done by Iran against Saudi Arabia. We could have taken action 10, 15 minutes later. I mean, that's the speed of attribution in a kinetic world. In the cyber world, same country, Iran, same victim, Saudi Aramco, cyber attack. I think it took us 4 or 5 months to do the attribution. And the only thing harder than one democracy doing an attribution is if we want to get together with a couple allies and have 2 democracies do it, you can add a couple more months. So, and in reality, the private sector, Aramco called it almost immediately, right? And then you see that in the attack in Ukraine on Viasat. It was called almost immediately by private sector security companies as Russia. And even though it was done within hours of a Russian invasion of the country, the U.S. was a little slow to attribute it to Russia. It's just that attribution thing's important, because your next step of replying or determining what's my escalatory or non-escalatory response is going to be inherently limited if you can't get attribution right. So that's something we're still working on. It's really important, and it's it's definitely going to impact cyber warfare's impact on warfare.
And part of that goes to the proxies that our adversaries are using. What Cynthia was talking about, where you have nation states that are effectively utilizing their cyber criminals in order to achieve the same ends that their military cyber actors would. But for us, that means that attribution has to go a step further, because we have to make the case as a US government or as allies, as a coalition. We then have to make the case that it's not just criminal actors. We have to show definitively that there is a tie to their government in order for us to respond in kind.
Yeah, I definitely want to pull on that thread. I mean, just zooming out for a moment, we're really getting away from these one-off cyber attacks and really facing long-term persistent campaigns from nation states. So to your question about what are the implications for dealing with this type of environment these days, it's really incumbent upon the private sector to be partnering very closely with our government partners here, both in law enforcement and at organizations like the CCC and JCDC at NSA and DHS. Because we don't all have the single best picture, right? We have different sets of authorities as well, and attribution is not one that the private sector owns, but we can probably give with some pretty high confidence who we think might be behind a certain incident, and that also does contribute to 1 or 2 democracies making attribution. Some of these actors are like, okay, cool, yeah, it was us, and it's bragging rights, but when you put the weight of multiple governments and reputable private sector companies behind that, it does send a stronger signal in the community.
And I think the key to note is that just because the private sector can come out really quick and say, it's this person, the government can't. and that's because we have a higher level of proof. Please don't believe that we don't know who it is initially also. Like, we can hold our own in this space, right? But if we're gonna make decisions potentially to take kinetic action and take lives as a result, we have to hold ourselves to the moral high ground and take a little bit longer to beyond a shadow of a doubt so that we can hold our head up as the moral high ground of the globe to say, yes, this definitively was them. It was sponsored by the government, and it's beyond a shadow of a doubt, and that's what it's gonna enable us to take action, whatever kind of action that might be.
And I think, adding to that though, some of the work that we do in advance of any type of, especially a major conflict like we might see with China-Taiwan in the future, depends on us having hard conversations early. Like, does it matter if we see a country actually direct a cyber criminal group to do something, or that the cyber criminal group just can do something? Because there's a world in which a country can just say, go at it, have fun, and that's not a directive approach. But do we still hold that country accountable? And I think those are the conversations that we all have to be having right now.
Well, I think some of that comes down to both a legislative question and a question of international law and what is the definition of cyber warfare. Because under traditional definitions of warfare, you know very clearly what it is, in that an incursion into another nation state's sovereign territory could potentially be an act of war which would give justification for responding in kind or to respond through self-defense. Cyberspace is patently different, partially because of the targets. And so I want to anchor on that for a second. And Stacy, I think you're probably best to answer this question. But the concept of cyber warfare, as it continues to evolve, we continue to see private sector entities, we continue to see governments, and we continue to see the overlap with proxies. How is this new concept, this new era of cyber warfare, specifically impacting individuals, companies in the private sector? And how can they best safeguard themselves to be combatants on this new battlefield?
Yeah, so it's a really tough question, and I think that the community writ large is really trying to sort it out. I think we've been trying to do it for a long time, but the war in Ukraine and future potential conflict in Taiwan is really accelerating the conversation. But so first, I would be remiss if I didn't mention one aspect of cybersecurity companies or tech companies in general participating or assisting a government that's under attack by another nation state. And for example, with the war in Ukraine, Mandiant has been supporting that government in critical infrastructure entities well before the war began, and within the very beginning hours of that war, we were activated because we had pre-existing relationships. But what I'll tell you is the impact on those individuals has been severe. We are hearing from our analysts that they love the mission but hate the job. So this is actually sparking, you could hold a whole nother panel on this conversation about the cybersecurity workforce, but there's a particular thread there around, how do you automate some of what we're doing in these types of environments when so much is at stake and it's 24/7, right? So that's one impact to cyber defenders that, again, I would be remiss if I didn't mention it in this room. But zooming out again, thinking about this concept as international humanitarian law is different than international human rights. What we're talking about in the former is really about what's occurring during conflict, right? So when you think about cyber warfare, it's disruption, degradation, denial of service, misinformation and disinformation, trying to erode values in a democracy. All of those things play into cyber warfare. And when you think about a cybersecurity company like Mandiant, who's been providing support and likely will in other conflicts down the road, we have to think about what types of protections we have. There's the obvious one to get them out of country, right? They're in a war zone. But then it's also, how do you protect them? And when you look at some of the theories around international humanitarian law, it's about direct causation. So if I'm an analyst and I'm, hands on keyboard, if I'm actually defending a network, am I indirectly in some way helping the belligerent state? And what I mean by that is the aggressor state. You don't necessarily know what those consequences are, so it's hard to actually determine if those protections are lost or not. It has to be taken on a case-by-case basis, and it's very difficult to do when you're in the middle of a wartime situation. One of the things that we've been talking a lot about within Mandiant and Google, and then also with organizations like the International Community for Red Cross, is, these companies who are going in need to provide assessments, not only to look at physical presence they might have in a country where they are providing this type of support, but also the types of activities that are being performed and whether or not they would be considered protected. And that needs to feed into a risk calculus for a private sector company to provide support during the war. We're used to doing this for years, and Mark can probably talk to this eloquently in a kinetic situation when you're dealing with the defense industrial base supporting wars over the years. This is very different, new domain. And the last point I'll make on it, Mike, is, and I don't have the answer, again, I think we're still grappling with it, is this a cyber war or is this a cyber component to a kinetic war? And what are the implications for how you define that? We've been having conversations about invoking Article 5. We haven't done that since 9/11. So these are really big, esoterical conversations that need to happen, but in a very thoughtful and deliberate way.
And I think that's a really important point. And what we're talking about, we continuously hear the push for public-private partnership. And I'm as big of an advocate as anyone because cyberspace is patently different. But in its difference, we need to understand what it looks like in the kinetic sense versus what it looks like in the digital world, so to speak. In the kinetic sense, you know very clearly who the combatants on the battlefield are. You know who the belligerents are. In cyberspace, it's very different. And in some cases, as you pointed out, Mandiant doesn't necessarily know what the long-standing implications are going to be for some of their actions, similar to Starlink, or actions that Elon Musk may or may not take in Ukraine. And so I'm going to gear this question towards Natalie. Natalie, right now you're the only panelist who's a uniformed service member actively engaged in cyber combat against our adversaries. With that in mind, what is it when you look across the board and across the spectrum of cyber warfare and you see the military and you see the private sector and you see law enforcement, what are the deconfliction mechanisms currently that you can speak to that are helping you to do your job to ensure that there's not unnecessary blowback when the Department of Defense takes an action?
Mm-hmm. I would say from the beginning when Cyber Command stood up, right, 10 plus years ago, that's been a key component of it, right? Because it goes back to if we're going to stand on the moral high ground as the United States and tell the globe this is the way to be accountable and to do the ethical right decisions in this new domain that we still haven't figured out laws and standards and everything else for, then we have to ensure we're there. And so it is absolutely, and it has been at the beginning and still is today, it's a whole of government approach, right? Whether it's the DoD or any other aspect of the government or the private sector, before we decide to take specific actions, there is a deconfliction process where we take a look at all the risk, we take a look at everybody's equities, we take a look at second and third order effects, so that way that the responsible commander can make the most appropriate risk decision on what we're doing, when, and why, and how.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to understand. And what you discussed earlier is the speed with which Cyber Command is able to do that, or the speed with which the US government is able to do attribution definitively or to respond definitively, doesn't just take into account who the actor is or what IP address they're coming from, but it takes into account a whole world of information that we now need to look at. And so, Cynthia, something you said earlier, you mentioned attribution and the speed with which we do attribution. From the FBI perspective and from the law enforcement perspective, when it comes to a wartime scenario, which I would argue we're not yet in a wartime scenario fully, but we very well may be moving there in the very near future, how fast do we have to do attribution in comparison to the way we do it now?
I think we're going to have to do it faster than we do it now. And Mark, you said it really well, where so many of our follow-on actions depend on attribution first. We can't take those other actions. So if we don't get to attribution, we are going to be behind and constantly responding instead of being able to get ahead. That being said, the way we do attribution can change. We don't have to get down to this is the actor's name and their address and the places they've traveled. We can get to country level attribution. A great example of that is the Iranian activity prior to the 2020 election, where the US government was able to quickly come out and say, these are Iran-based actors, this is the campaign, this is what they're doing. About a year later, we were able to come out with the indictments and attendant sanctions and rewards for justice from state leading to the capture of them. So we were able to put their names out there and build that entire case that we need over the course of a year, but really rapidly tell the American public, this is an Iranian campaign, this is what to expect, this is what you need to know. And I think that's a great model moving forward, where you can say, this is this type of campaign, this is from this country, and then follow on with some of those details later. And don't get me wrong, the details are important. I think it's a huge element of the international cyber norming, the bringing on board our allies, because they need to have those details. The indictments are great rundowns that anybody or any leader can use with their public to talk about why they're taking actions. But if we're talking about protection, if we're talking about response, I think we can do that country level, and we can do that a lot faster than we've done some of the traditional wait until we know their names.
Mark, do you want to chime in on that?
Well, I agree we could do better. I'm more. I think we've discussed attribution pretty well. I'm more worried about the previous question about the public-private collaboration.
Yeah.
I actually think we are 23 years into a voluntary partnership that is really a failure. I think that you're going to see. You mentioned it in one of your questions that the battle space that we're defending is 85%. Owned and operated by the private sector or state and local governments, not the federal government. And the Department of Defense really has a hands-off attitude towards that, and that makes sense. There's a lot of reasons for that. There's some National Guard capabilities, but the reality is most of us are comfortable with our military not moving around our domestic battle space or our intelligence agencies. But the next step is, okay, where are the Homeland Security capabilities? And they're just not there. We haven't fully developed the hunt and incident response teams. We haven't fleshed out those systems. We haven't got the, we're not ready to start giving, authorizing private sector companies, issue letters of marque to go take care of problems that they see. We don't want them moving out of the United States infrastructure overseas and potentially escalating a situation for our government. So we don't have good answers on this. And I think we need to very rapidly, and I'll give you, Department of Defense frustrates me because they do a fantastic job making sure Fort Hood has perfect, multiple water systems, multiple power. They're ready for the resiliency, redundancy of a cyber attack. But as the tank is on a train leaving Fort Hood, it's like it enters Mad Max, and it's now on Norfolk Southern or somebody headed towards Charleston Port, which is itself, very vulnerable to Chinese manipulation in the crane systems there or the automated systems.
It's Chinese cranes that are actually lifting those tanks.
90% of the cranes, and they're almost all automated in our 19 strategic sea lift ports are Chinese. So we have this flaw where the DoD is secure on its bases, but relies on the national critical infrastructure for what's called military mobility. That's train systems, rail systems, highway systems, port systems, aviation systems. And those are not protected properly. And then that doesn't even get into the electrical power grid that supports all that, the telecommunication systems. So we have we have a big mismatch, and if we get in a fight with a country like, if we get in a crisis with a country like China, NSA is leaking, and it is an intentional leak, to tell us that China is when two officials do it on the same day in different cities, it's a coordinated leak, that, hey, China has malware in a lot of our infrastructure systems. It's starting in Guam and the West Coast, but it's everywhere. The leak is starting about Guam and the West Coast, but I believe it's proliferated everywhere. We're at a real risk here. We have a disconnect between a system that the Department of Defense and broadly our whole country, the whole of government needs, and an effort that is much less than the whole of government.
Excuse me. I think these are 2 points I'd like to tie together, because we talked about attribution and some of the rules in which it seems that the government is under as it relates to attribution, as it relates to making public disclosures of who is overall responsible for cyber incidents. And then we also, in the same breath, talk about the risk that faces our critical infrastructure. And to me, it seems that there is a gap here, because we have lots of legislation on the criminal side that says, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, if you gain unauthorized access or exceed authorized access to a computer, the FBI can come after you. The Department of Justice can come after you under federal law. We have international law which dictates what we can and can't do in international space from a military perspective. We have lots of rules and regulations. But it seems like there's a gap as it relates to how do we address attribution quickly? How do we make public disclosures? And similarly, it seems like there's a gap from a legislative perspective in how do we most effectively guard and protect our defense critical infrastructure? So with that very long-winded intro to this question, Is there any currently proposed legislation that seeks to address some of these shortfalls in cybersecurity, in cyber warfare?
So, well, first, I got to say the real gap is, like, it's great that we indict, like, the North Korean army officers that took down Sony. But, you know, most of us know we don't have an extradition treaty with North Korea. And in fact, when we announced, like, 9 months or a year after the event that it was these 3 or 4 guys and we're indicting them, I think the next thing was Kim Jong-un invited them up for an award ceremony. I mean, I don't think that we don't have a way of punishing our true authoritarian adversaries in this, like the way we do a criminal, where I do think the FBI and Department of Justice have been very effective. So there is that. In terms of legislation, you know, there is legislation being pushed to, you know, do a better job at, we've got legislation for a pilot for continuity of the economy. That's studying that exact issue I gave you, the infrastructure as we leave a base and try to get to a port. But look, we've been pushing a rock up a hill. The Trump and Biden administrations both are like, you know, like don't legislate this, we're working it, but we'd see no obvious evidence of that. I mean, the fact is it's going to take legislation to get the systems right, and appropriations, to get the systems right to have the non-DoD parts of the government more capable of providing assistance both pre-event, you know, in terms of exercising to identify shortfalls and remediate them, during an event and incident response, and in recovery and reconstitution. We have not made those kind of consistent investments, and both on a bipartisan basis, the executive branch has been unhelpful, whereas on a bipartisan basis, the legislature knows something is wrong. And this is going to be a real issue for our country if we don't figure out how to make ourselves a more resilient target, because we are not going to be able. I believe in this defend forward, persistent engagement, going overseas and trying to take down people before they come after you. But it's not realistic that we can do that against China or Russia in a comprehensive basis. We have to be a better defended target, and we're certainly not there yet.
Don't you think so? Oh, still go ahead.
No, I just want to build on the comment about resilience, because that's incredibly important. And I tend to agree with Mark. I mean, look, I've been in this town for more than 20 years, and I wrote a thesis on Congress's inability to pass any meaningful cybersecurity legislation, CERCIA notwithstanding. So I understand those pain points. And, you know, to the administration's credit, we do have a national cybersecurity strategy. DoD just put their strategy out. You know, I think the tone and tenor is there, and we're faced with a ton of regulatory requirements. A lot of directives and security standards are being pushed out sector by sector, but the resiliency piece is really important here. And I think there needs to be a way for us to pause and look at systemic risk. If we were to face a massive catastrophic event, cybersecurity event, incident in this country, I think we would be in poor shape to respond. And so when I talk about systemic risk, I'm saying, okay, so if you have one sector that goes down, what are the cascading effects to others that you might be reliant on to transport goods, to get electricity? So that's an important piece that I think is missing. And I think that there are little tranches in the government that are looking at this. Very familiar with systemically important entities, and you know, the realistic part to this is that every sector thinks that they're critical, but it's really, you have to think about, from a national security perspective, from an economic viability perspective, what really are those effects of a major catastrophic event, and how do we pre-position ourselves to address those risks? So hopefully we start leaning in that direction, and legislation might be required to do that, but I think there are multiple policy levers we can pull to do that.
You know, I think to add to both of your great points, which I agree with, one of the cruxes of this, though, is that there's a mismatch in funding across various industries, and that might be because they're just municipally owned versus, you know, have a huge financial backing. But in the end, we have to be able to get the right kind of funding to some of these groups so that they can just know how to turn on logs so they can even give us the data to begin with, or put in some of the more simple cybersecurity steps. And I think there's a lot of good grants that have gone out for that, but it's not enough. We have to do more. But there's also an element here of the private sector sometimes doesn't quite understand what the government actually cares about and wants. And we see this a lot where if we're going to a company and we're trying to talk to them or an industry and saying, hey, like, we think there might have been a problem on your system. What, can we have X data, or can we, deploy one of our hunt teams? There's a kind of wrong idea that we care about the content of the emails or anything like that. We want the background data. We want like this back end things, and I think that there's a cyber acumen there and an understanding of exactly what's actually helpful for us versus I don't care about like what customer you emailed on January 5th. So like trying to, I think, get that basic level of like what the government actually cares about would also increase some of that engagement with the government.
Let's not backdoor this panel to the 702 discussion if we can help it.
So please tell everyone to pass 702.
Yeah,
But you're totally right, Cynthia, and there's disparity among all the sectors in the level of cyber hygiene and maturity too, right? So you have some sectors like financial services who are well positioned, and I think it's easier to get what you need from those sectors, but then you have others who are not as mature. Even in healthcare, you have some hospitals who are super sophisticated and they have actual cybersecurity personnel inside their IT departments, and then you have others who have no idea what to do in an incident. We do a lot of data breach simulations that have been all over the country, talking with CI owners and operators and private sector companies. And, there are some entities who are calling 911 when they're in the middle of an incident. They don't know that they can call a local FBI field office. They don't know what CISA is, or that they have regional and field offices now to provide that type of technical assistance when they're in the middle of a breach. So there's a whole nother component to this around education and trying to kind of do some level setting. And I think you see that thematically in the latest national cybersecurity strategy to kind of bring that level of maturity up across the sectors, but it's gonna take a really long time to do. And entities need to be incentivized to pay attention and dedicate their resources to doing this kind of work. Until they feel that pain, they might not really dedicate what they need to for cybersecurity.
Michael, I know you got another question, but I got to pick up on one thing here, in that I think there's a great opportunity that we're probably going to screw up coming, which is that to solve a lot of this, we're pushing hard, the government and leading private sector, trying to get as many utilities and people who are and small, medium-sized businesses into the cloud, saying, hey, if you join the cloud, it'll improve your opportunity for security. And two factors go into that. One, you don't lose your responsibility for security. You can still have horrific cyber hygiene in your company and screw up the fact that you have some benefits from cloud service providers. But two, the cloud service providers themselves, and I'm going to say a four-letter word here, regulation. The cloud, we don't have a standard of care in the cloud that's guaranteed. And we're at some point, when I said 23 years of a voluntary system has proven itself unwieldy, we're going to have a better balance of regulation, incentivization, and collaboration. And that some of that regulation might come at the minimum in standards, but at the maximum in regulation. That says, look, if you're if you're one of these really important critical infrastructure companies, you have to have this level of cybersecurity in the cloud and in how you conduct your business. If you're a critical infrastructure, it's this level. If you're Vicks dry cleaner, it's down here. But in there, you have to have that. And look, this is hard. This is an area where the government doesn't want to be that guy. And the cloud service providers definitely don't want to be the recipients of that. But the beneficiaries, the utilities, the small and medium-sized businesses, without it, I do not think will get secure. So this is going to be a big challenge for us.
Well, and I think that's important. And Stacy, please don't tell your colleagues at Google Cloud I said this, but cloud services are not a panacea of security that many people view them to be. It is just a storage element. There are aspects of security that are improved by migrating to the cloud, but unto itself, it's not just a secure environment. And I don't think a lot of small businesses, or even large businesses for that matter, really grasp that or really realize it to utilize it in an effective way, to make sure that they have logging turned on, to make sure that all of the X, Y, and Z of cybersecurity in a normal environment also applies to the cloud. And Mark, as you said, if your cyber hygiene sucks on-prem, it's probably going to suck in the cloud too. And so we need to address those issues. One thing, Cynthia, you said the mismatch in funding, and I made a point to come back to that because there are two areas here that I really want to hit on. And I think the mismatch in funding is a critical aspect of it, and it's something that is potentially a legislative issue, but it's certainly a budgetary issue, both on the public sector side as well as the private sector side. So, Natalie, I'm going to gear this towards you. Would you consider us right now, based on what you're seeing in the China Outcomes Group, but also just writ large, given your experience in cyber operations, do you believe that we are in an arms race with respect to emerging technology?
Absolutely, and this is why, right? Like in cybersecurity, we're used to, the two sides of the coin, offense and defense, like it's drummed into our head. When it comes to emerging technology, I'd say there's another coin we should think about, and that's one side is innovation, and the other side is weaponization. There are companies, organizations, and nation states today that are putting a ton of resources in coming up with what the next emerging disruptive technology is going to be, right? To be first to market. And they have great reasons why. Like it's going to save humanity, and it's going to make us more efficient, and it's going to cure hunger, or whatever reasons they think this next thing is going to be the bee's knees, right? But as much as that occurs, on the flip side, there are a bunch of companies, organizations, and nation states that are doing their best to weaponize that technology and no longer waiting to weaponize it till it hits market, but to get in on the ground floor and weaponize all aspects of the development of whether that's software or hardware. And we know the People's Republic of China is kind of known for the long game, and they are very focused on putting a lot of their efforts, not necessarily in developing the tech, when they can just steal the IP from the rest of us, but in weaponizing it. And so I would say we are absolutely in an arms race right now. And it's not the arms race of our parents, right? It's not about government stockpiling nuclear warheads. The arms race right now is not just to be the innovative person to get that tech out, but more importantly, for us to figure out how to defend against a weaponization that we're not tracking and we don't understand. And the difference between my parents' arms race and the arms race today, that arms race was all about nation states. The arms race today, each and every one of you out there can have a piece to play in that arms race to ensure that the U.S. is put in a better place against the adversaries and the upcoming conflicts we're going to have around the globe.
And great answer. And to that end, where each and every one of us has a role to play, we still see that there is a disparity or discrepancy in our cyber workforce. I've seen numbers that we're missing between 410 and 700,000 people in cybersecurity across the country that jobs we need to fill. And so this is both a force generation and a force management problem and I use those terms based on my background in the DoD, but it applies equally to the private sector. If you don't have those personnel, if you're not educating them, if you're not training people in the right way, and then if you're not managing them to be able to access these advanced technologies or to develop these innovations, we run into an issue. And so from a cyber force development and management perspective, Mark, this is something you've talked about pretty extensively. How do we navigate that landscape specifically, either within the federal government, the private sector, or both, such that we are addressing the issues and addressing the cybersecurity workforce shortage, but also the risks that we face on the private sector side as well as in the government?
Well, certainly we're taking a hard look at the government now, and I commend the administration's National Cybersecurity Workforce Education Strategy, particularly its Pillar 4 that goes at it's the most explicit and detailed pillar. It's the pillar that looks at the federal workforce. And I think that makes sense because the one thing the White House can probably fix easiest is the federal workforce as opposed to the national workforce of the national education system. And in there, I think there are a lot of really good ideas about how you compensate people, well, first how you recruit them, how you prepare them for success. Right now we have no, DoD, when you join the military, you go to boot camp, but then you go to a school and C school where we make you skilled in whatever military competency you're going to have. In the federal workforce, we infrequently do that. And in cyber, it shows. We have a lot of trouble getting the right people in with the right skill sets, but if you could have someone with the right passion and a little bit of the skills you wanted, and you had a workforce development institute that kind of leveled the playing field. NSA does this for their cyber hires. We need to do this for the federal government. And then what you'd have is a competent workforce that hits the ground running at the GS7, GS8, GS9 level. And then that same place can be where you grow your mid-career people. Because right now we're just poaching from each other. Federal agencies are. And where you can actually develop your mid-career people, send them away for a month's training and certifications. And based on their skills that they've developed as an entry-level person, they could get your mid-career jobs. And I'd even send my HR people, my talent management people there so they can learn how to hire. I get a little nervous that the same, Department of Agriculture person's, hiring a food inspector, and I hope they're kick-ass good at that because I don't want mad cow disease. But then they turn around 5 minutes later, they're like, all right, let me see, who's this system administrator I'm looking at now? It's highly unlikely unless they've had some special training to do it. So that, recruiting, developing, and then we do need to compensate properly. Not all federal cyber workforce payment structures are wrong. In some areas, we compete well with the private sector, but in others, we clearly don't. And in those, we need to have cyber accepted service so that we can control the pay band in there to compensate. A lot of people work in the government because of the mission, because of their passion to serve, and that's fantastic. But at the same time, if that compensation gap gets too large, we'll lose those talented people. And the final thing is legislation allows quicker movement back and forth to the private sector. The private sector will gain immensely from federal workers coming into them, and the federal workforce will gain immensely from having them return, or having other private sector return, having a fluid movement back and forth. Remember, we're defending the battle space together, right? This isn't like submarine warfare. We don't need, Mandiant workers coming into the Navy to help us with hunt submarines. But we do need them to come into our federal workforce to work on cyber. It's a very unique mission area that way. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here. I think you're going to see both the Hill. There's bills on there that are sponsored by as wide a variety as Ro Khanna in the House and Mike Rounds in the Senate, the same kind of bill. So it's bipartisan and covers the whole political spectrum. And I think the administration will support it. We could get success in here next year in a legislative year that will not have a lot of success. I think cyber workforce could be one.
And so you touched on both force generation and force management there as it relates to bringing new personnel in, getting them trained, but also making sure that they have the tools available to them so they can grow in their careers. I think one of the other challenges that we continue to see, aside from just the workforce in numbers and skill, is also culture, and the culture that they're growing up in within the government. And in a lot of cases in the DoD, we applaud shooters. We applaud those operational warfighters who are in traditional MOSs and traditional service elements like infantry or pilots or something to that degree. Natalie, what do you see as being the biggest challenge to having an effective cyber force or cyber operations force writ large from a cultural perspective?
So many challenges, and we only have 4 minutes and 39 seconds left. But, right?
You can get one.
Okay.
One challenge.
One challenge. We've talked a lot about people. I think the biggest challenge is, as you said, the culture, right? Cyber right now is in each of the different forces. It's in the Army, it's in the Air Force, it's in the Marines, right? It's, I guess, in Space Force. Right? But they all have their core competencies. Their whole purpose of those forces is to fight and win our nation's battles in that domain. That's what they're experts on. And then they see this cyber thing as, well, those are techie, geeky folks. They're not like the infantry soldier or the Marine or the aviator, right? Like they're those techie, geeky folks, and they're just an add-on afterwards, right? Which is why a lot of people talk about, well, maybe it's time to get a cyber force, right? And we'll just pull all those people together and we will rethink how we do talent management, and we'll rethink how we do retention and recruitment and education and how we value our people differently, and it will be great. And I'm like, yes, that would be great, but maybe not right at this very moment, which is a different opinion than many people have. And I say this is why not at this moment do we need to upset the apple cart with this cultural issue. And that is, if you listen to Admiral Aquilino speak, so he's the Indo-PACOM commander, he says in the next 18 months, we are going to be in crisis and then conflict with the People's Republic of China. So even if we crafted a cyber force and fixed all these problems today and crafted our own thing, what would happen? Well, it's got to be manned with people and money, so we would just steal everything that said cyber from all the other forces. All those budget lines, they've been sprinkling the word cyber on to get lots of extra money from Congress for the last decade. And all the people they sprinkle cyber on so they can get more of. And we'll put them in this new organization, and then all of a sudden you've got these Air Force yahoos that are like, I don't need to worry about cyber anymore. Network defense, I don't care about IT security. There's that other service that has to deal with it. I can just now focus on flying, not understanding that their aircraft is not going to launch, is not going to fly, is not going to get fueled if we don't have networks that are secure, right? And so I think in this time, especially with this very short timeline we have where we're potentially going into crisis and conflict, taking this away from commanders and letting them advocate this idea that some brand new organization that's just getting its feet wet will be ready is just not the appropriate time to do it. But ultimately, I think for us to be successful, we've got to look at how to fix the culture. And I think the only way that'll happen is if all of a sudden cyber folks are led by cyber techie folks and not by aviators, tankers, and infantry officers. Though they're great human beings, they just don't get us.
And let me jump in on that. First half, you had completely right. It is the time. Second half, though, I have to disagree. Look, we created a space force. I didn't hear of any satellites crashing into each other while we did it. Turns out the military is very good at transitioning. As Admiral McLaughlin would say, if you completed a statement, the window of opportunity starts in 18 months and ends 12 years from now. So if the idea is that we're going to and 12 years from now, we're going to start doing it. That's 12 more years of incredibly poor cyber readiness. Only one service does this right. It's the Army. The other service, you didn't even mention the Navy, which I agree with you.
Yeah,
we're awful at it. And Michael's actually part of that. But what I would say is it's time. Look, cybercom will still be the force employer. That's not going anywhere. So I do believe we'll still be having that. The force, we need to have a Secretary of Army and Cyber who's the lead force generator, bring it together. We need to start recruiting properly. We need to stop recruiting. You recruit most of your military services outside like the men's and women's locker rooms at the high schools. I think you'll be recruiting the cyber force outside the robotics club. It's just a much different way of thinking about who you want in, what the rule sets are, what your physical requirements are, everything about it. And they have to be compensated differently. Right now, all the services compensate differently. And when people find out the person, man or woman right next to them is making 40% more just because they're in a different service, doing the same job, maybe worse, you actually lose both of them over that period of time. So my thought is, I absolutely agree we have the problem you talked about, but to solve it, we're going to need a cyber force, and you might as well rip the Band-Aid off, get it started now.
It's amazing. You actually stopped right on 0. So as we finish up, I want to give everyone just a key takeaway that each one of you want to leave the audience with before we step off stage.
I think the key takeaway that I hope everyone takes is, we have a lot of private sector in here, a lot of overlap with government, and it's about the need to, before we have legislation, before we can fix all the problems, you can actually make a difference now. You can partner, you can reach out to your local FBI field office, you can highlight if your customers have a problem, who to call, and you can really be the advocate for what matters and what we really need to be able to use to be able to win the next war, which is the sharing of data, the ability to know how wide a problem is and what our adversary is going to do next.
So defending our national critical infrastructure is inherently a public-private collaboration that absolutely has to up its game.
Yeah, I'm going to continue on this thread and bring it back to Ukraine and cyber warfare. The public-private sector collaboration is not a catchphrase. It's beyond partnership, it's about collaboration, and it's about building these trusted relationships as private sector companies with government entities all over the world. And I'll just close with an anecdote. I've spent the past 15 months supporting Mandiant and our support to the war in Ukraine, and had the privilege to go to NATO multiple times. And we were sitting with the NATO mission to Ukraine just maybe 5 or 6 months into the war, and it was a small room, and it was very quiet and tense. And finally, one of the gentlemen looked at me and my boss and said, well, Mandiant was with us in the beginning hours of the war, and if it weren't for you, we would have fallen to the Russians. And now That's not to say that there weren't other entities who were providing support, but it was a very real moment and realization that that decades-long relationship that we had with the Ukrainian government made it very easy to go human being to human being and say, in the next couple of hours, this is about to pop off, activate. And we were able to do that very quickly. And so I leave you with that. When you think about being a partner to the government, it's beyond just setting up your direct commercial engagements. It's about being that trusted partner so that when they really are in crisis mode, they can turn to you.
I would say, unlike in decades past, defending the nation now, today, is not for the 1% of us that join the military. I can't be successful without each and every one of you all, because most of the terrain that needs to be defended is not mine. So just because you don't wear a uniform every day to work and get to choose whatever you want to wear to work, I'm telling you, that's a nice benefit you all have. We can't be successful without each and every one of you in all of society.
Well, that's all we have. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the esteemed panelists, and we'll be out in the lobby. Excellent. This way. Oh.